the town of Crestwood had always been a quiet place, tucked between endless fields and dense forests. People there lived simple lives, teachers, farmers, shopkeepers, all connected by familiar faces and old traditions. No one could have imagined that their world would be shattered overnight. It started with a strange news report. A small incident at a nearby research facility had forced an evacuation. Most dismissed it as just another chemical leak or a government experiment gone wrong. But by nightfall, strange figures were seen wandering the roads, their movements jerky, their eyes hollow. At the Willow Creek Diner, the evening rush was in full swing when the first screams tore through the parking lot. Emily Carter, a waitress working her usual double shift, dropped a tray of plates as a man stumbled inside, bloodied and wild-eyed. His clothes were torn, and deep scratches marked his arms. He tried to speak but collapsed before anyone could reach him. Seconds later, figures appeared at the entrance, dozens of them, pale and twisted. Their skin was grayish, their mouths agape in silent hunger. At first, people thought it was a prank. Then the first victim fell, and the chaos truly began. Emily ducked behind the counter as the creatures flooded in, dragging customers to the floor. She could hear the horrifying sounds of struggle, chairs overturning, glass breaking, people crying out. She knew she had to move. Adrenaline pushed her into action. Across the street, Dan Rivers, a former high school coach, watched from the sporting goods store. He grabbed a wooden baseball bat from a display and ran outside. Years of training his players kicked in, stay calm, keep moving, defend yourself. He swung the bat hard, knocking down one of the undead that had cornered a mother and her young son. Inside the store. Hurry! Dan shouted, motioning them to safety. Meanwhile, further down Main Street, Marcus Lee, a mechanic known more for his quick hands than his courage, was locked in his garage, peering through the window. His heart pounded in his chest. He watched as people he had known for years, neighbors, friends, became something unrecognizable. Some tried to fight. Most didn't stand a chance. Grabbing a wrench and a set of keys, Marcus made a choice. He couldn't stay hidden forever. Back at the diner, Emily spotted her coworker, Jenna, trapped behind a tipped table. Without thinking, Emily rushed toward her, using a chair to shove the creatures back. She grabbed Jenna's hand and pulled her toward the kitchen door. The back door was blocked, but the fire exit wasn't. Kicking it open, they stumbled into the night, only to find the streets were no safer. Fires had started in some buildings, and cars were abandoned in the middle of the road. The entire town was unraveling. In the chaos, ordinary people like Emily, Dan, and Marcus realized something terrifying: help was not coming. Whatever had caused this outbreak had spread too fast. The phones were down, and the only sound was the moaning of the undead and the occasional desperate scream. As the night deepened, the survivors gathered at the town's old community center. It was a stone building, sturdy and easy to defend. But supplies were low, and fear was high. Dan took charge instinctively. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to break in," he said, holding the bloodied bat at his side. "We have to work together. We have to fight." Emily, still shaking but determined, nodded. "We have no choice." Marcus arrived moments later, breathless and carrying whatever tools he could scavenge. He dumped them on a table: hammers, crowbars, chains. "It's not much," he said, "but it's a start." No one in that room had ever been a soldier. They weren't trained for battles or emergencies. But something in the air shifted. Survival demanded more than fear. It demanded courage. As the dead pounded against the walls outside, a plan began to form inside. Ordinary people were about to do extraordinary things. And this was just the beginning. Inside the battered old community center, tension hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud. The survivors, barely 24 of them, huddled together, listening to the faint thud-thud-thud of the undead slamming against the boarded windows. Dan Rivers stood near the front, his hands calloused and steady around the baseball bat. "First things first," he said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "We fortify this place. Every window, every door. We use whatever we can find. The group nodded, still dazed but desperate for leadership. Emily Carter, wiping blood from a small cut on her forehead, added, "We should split into teams. Some reinforce the center, others search for food, weapons, anything." Marcus Lee adjusted the tool belt he had thrown together from the mechanic shop. "I'll fix up whatever you find. Locks, barricades, traps, you name it." No one argued. They needed a plan, and they needed to move fast. They scavenged everything they could, metal pipes from the maintenance closet, old desks turned into makeshift barricades, even fire extinguishers in case the fires spreading outside reached them. The place became a fortress, at least for now. Meanwhile, Dan organized a scouting party. 5 volunteers, including Emily and Marcus, would venture into the heart of Crestwood at first light. Supplies were critical. Without food, water, and better weapons, survival would be a losing game. That night, sleep was impossible. The pounding of the undead was constant, a grim lullaby no one could escape. Emily sat with her back against a cold wall, Jenna asleep beside her, still clutching a kitchen knife like it was a lifeline. Emily's mind raced. She had spent her life serving coffee and memorizing regulars' orders. Now she was preparing to fight monsters she didn't understand. She wasn't a soldier. None of them were. But something deep inside her, something she never knew existed, had been awakened. She wasn't going to die cowering. In the dark, a voice broke the silence. "What if they never stop coming?" a teenage boy whispered from across the room. Dan answered without hesitation. "Then we don't stop fighting." Morning came, thick with smoke and a chilling silence. The streets of Crestwood were barely recognizable, overturned cars, shattered glass, abandoned belongings everywhere. Fires still smoldered in some places, sending black plumes into the gray sky. The scouting team moved cautiously, every sound making them flinch. Emily gripped a crowbar tightly in her hands, her knuckles white. Marcus led the way, his keen eyes scanning for threats. They hit the grocery store first. Most shelves were picked clean, but a few cans of food remained. Water bottles, too. They loaded what they could into backpacks. Suddenly, a sharp noise, the creak of a door, made them freeze. From the back of the store, a figure lurched into view. A man, or what used to be a man, dragging a broken leg behind him. His mouth hung open, teeth bared in a silent snarl. Emily acted without thinking. She swung the crowbar with every ounce of strength she had. The blow sent the creature crashing into a shelf, which collapsed with a deafening crash. The noise was a signal, a beacon. From outside, more of the undead began to emerge, drawn by the sound. "Move! Now!" Marcus barked. They fled through the broken storefront, supplies clutched tight, hearts pounding. Dozens of the undead gave chase, their guttural growls filling the air. The group sprinted through the maze of debris, ducking between abandoned cars and shattered fences. The creatures were fast, faster than they had expected, and the gap between them closed quickly. Marcus skidded to a stop at a narrow alley. "In here!" The team squeezed into the tight space, hearts hammering in their chests. The undead, too large to follow easily, clawed at the entrance but couldn't reach them, at least for now. Breathing hard, Emily leaned against the wall, feeling the rough bricks scrape her back. They had survived another close call, but only barely. "We can't keep running like this," she said, voice trembling with exhaustion and anger. "We have to find a better way to fight back." Marcus nodded grimly. "We need more than luck. We need a real plan." As they waited for the danger to pass, a fierce determination settled over the group. Ordinary people, yes, but they would become something more. The first real battle was coming, and they intended to be ready. The scouting team returned to the community center battered, breathless, but alive. Their backpacks were heavy with supplies, a small victory in a world crumbling faster than they could comprehend. Inside, the survivors gathered around as Dan Rivers laid out the cans of food and water bottles on a long table. There were murmurs of relief, small smiles exchanged, but no one could ignore the larger truth. The town was infested. Crestwood was lost. Dan looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as he could. We survived today because we moved fast. But it won't be enough tomorrow. The room went still. We need to fight smarter, he continued. We need to train. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Most of them were average townsfolk, bakers, retirees, college students. Picking up a bat or swinging a crowbar wasn't second nature to them. Seeing their hesitation, Emily Carter stepped forward, her voice steady. We don't have a choice. The world we knew is gone. If we don't adapt, we're next. Her words hit home. Marcus Lee, still breathing hard from the narrow escape, pulled out the tools he had salvaged. He laid them across another table, pipes, hammers, heavy chains, sharpened sticks. These aren't perfect weapons, he said, but in the right hands, they'll do. That afternoon, the community center transformed from a shelter into a training ground. Dan split the group into teams, those strong enough to fight, those quick enough to scavenge, and those who could build defenses. Emily worked with the younger survivors, showing them how to strike at the legs first, to knock the undead down, then deliver a final blow. You don't need to be stronger than them, she said, demonstrating a swift jab with her crowbar. You just have to be faster. Dan taught the others how to defend as a unit, how to watch each other's backs, how to move together as a wall of resistance rather than isolated individuals. Marcus, ever the problem solver, rigged makeshift weapons. He reinforced broomsticks with duct tape and scrap metal, turned kitchen knives into spear tips, and built shields out of car doors stripped from nearby wrecks. At first, the practice sessions were clumsy. People swung too wide, lost their footing, hesitated when facing the dummies they had set up. But as the hours passed, something changed. Movements grew sharper. Eyes grew fiercer. The fear that had paralyzed them was slowly being forged into something stronger. Courage. During a break, Jenna approached Emily, clutching a homemade spear. I don't know if I can really do it, she admitted, her voice trembling. I'm just a waitress. Emily placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We all were something else before this. Now, we're survivors. The sunset drenched the town in deep orange and purple hues, casting long shadows that danced across the broken streets. The night would bring more danger, it always did, but this time, the people of Crestwood wouldn't be waiting helplessly behind locked doors. As they prepared for the evening, the distant howls of the undead echoed once again across the ruined landscape. The survivors gathered by the boarded windows, gripping their makeshift weapons. We stand together, Dan said, his voice low but firm. No matter what comes. They knew it wouldn't be easy. Every battle would cost them. Every step forward would be fought for with blood, sweat, and grit. But they also knew this, they were no longer just ordinary townspeople clinging to survival. They were becoming fighters. And tonight, the undead would find Crestwood wasn't as helpless as it seemed. The waves were coming again, louder, fiercer, hungrier. But so were they. The night air was thick and still, the kind of silence that pressed against your chest and made every breath feel heavier. Inside the fortified community center, the survivors stood ready, hearts hammering, weapons clutched tightly in their sweaty hands. And then they heard it, a low, rumbling moan that grew louder by the second. From the darkness beyond the broken streets, they emerged, dozens, maybe hundreds of the undead, moving together in a slow, coordinated wave. Their eyes glinted in the moonlight, and their hands clawed the air as if already tasting victory. Dan Rivers stepped forward, baseball bat resting on his shoulder. His voice rang out calm and clear, hold the line. The first zombies slammed against the barricades, rattling the windows and clawing at the reinforced doors. Boards creaked under the strain, nails squealed in protest, but for now, the barriers held. Marcus Lee crouched near the entrance with two others, ready with fire extinguishers. Not to start fires, but to create blasts of cold, blinding mist if the undead broke through. Anything to slow them down. Inside, Emily Carter led a second line of defenders. Remember your training, she whispered to those around her. Aim for the legs first. Work together. A loud crack echoed through the room as a section of boarded window gave way. Gnarled hands punched through the gap, followed by snapping jaws. Dan swung hard. His bat connected with a sickening thud, sending the creature crumpling to the ground. Another shove through immediately after. The fight had begun. Zombies flooded into the building through the broken sections. The survivors stood firm. They swung bats, stabbed with spears, used whatever makeshift weapons they could. Screams filled the air, both human and monstrous, but no one fled. Not this time. Jenna, the young waitress who once trembled at the sight of them, stood her ground near Emily. When a zombie lunged toward her, she jabbed forward with her spear, her hands steady. It wasn't a perfect hit, but it staggered the creature long enough for Emily to finish it off. Across the room, Marcus unleashed a blast from a fire extinguisher, covering a small group of undead in white, icy fog. They thrashed blindly, giving the fighters a crucial opening to strike. Despite their efforts, the tide was relentless. For every zombie they dropped, more pushed through. The survivors began to fall back toward the center of the hall, forming a tight circle, back to back, protecting one another. Dan fought with furious determination, but even he knew they couldn't hold forever. "We need a way out," Marcus shouted over the chaos, dodging a swipe from a zombie's filthy hands. Emily's mind raced. The back exit, a narrow emergency door they had sealed but could break open if needed. "Follow me," she yelled, motioning to the others. They pushed hard, forcing a gap through the mass of undead, swinging and shoving with every ounce of strength they had left. Dan, Marcus, Emily, Jenna, and the others fought like they never had before, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Reaching the emergency door, Marcus smashed the lock with a crowbar. The door swung open, revealing the dark alley behind the center. One by one, they spilled out into the night, bruised, bloodied, but alive. They didn't stop to rest. They ran through the back alleys and broken streets, moving swiftly and silently, leaving the besieged center behind. The undead, slower in the narrow passages, couldn't keep up. Finally, several blocks away, they collapsed in the shadow of a toppled billboard. Chests heaving, muscles burning, they counted heads. 2 were missing. Grief clamped down on their hearts, 2 lives lost in their first real battle. Friends. Neighbors. Tears welled in Jenna's eyes, but she blinked them away. "They fought to give us a chance," she said, her voice hardening. "We can't waste it." Dan wiped blood from his forehead and nodded grimly. "We regroup. We fight smarter." Emily looked at the others, the exhausted, determined faces around her, and knew it was true. They were no longer just trying to survive. They were starting to fight back. And next time, they would be ready. In the distance, the moans of the undead still echoed through the night, but for the first time, it wasn't just fear that filled the survivors' hearts. It was fire. The battered group crouched under the collapsed billboard, catching their breath as the night stretched cold and endless around them. They had survived, but survival wasn't enough anymore. Dan Rivers wiped his hands on his torn jeans, his mind already racing ahead. "We can't keep running," he said quietly. "We're losing people. We're losing ground." Emily Carter leaned against the metal frame, wincing at a cut along her arm. "We have to change the rules. We can't wait for them to attack us." Jenna, gripping her makeshift spear with white-knuckled hands, nodded fiercely. "We fight them now." It was a bold idea, reckless, some might say, but everyone there understood. Staying on the defensive would only end one way: exhaustion, starvation, and defeat. If they wanted to live, they had to take the fight to the undead. Marcus Lee, the engineer among them, pulled out a crumpled map he had snatched from a gas station. By the weak light of a cracked flashlight, they studied the layout of Crestwood. "There's an old construction yard here," Marcus said, pointing to a spot near the industrial zone. "Equipment, tools, maybe even some working vehicles. If we can get to it," Emily said, her eyes narrowing, "we might be able to build traps. Fortify a stronghold. Even find a way to thin out their numbers." It was a dangerous plan, the construction yard was near a heavily infested area. But the risk came with a reward: control. Dan made the decision. We move at dawn. Quietly. No fighting unless we have no choice. We scout first. Plan second. Attack third. That night, there was little rest. Some dozed in shifts, while others sharpened weapons, reinforced their clothes with bits of scrap, and tied makeshift armor around their arms and legs. Anything to give them an edge. When the first light of dawn bled into the sky, painting the ruins of Crestwood in cold gray hues, the group set out. They moved like shadows through the back streets, stepping carefully around broken glass and debris. Every sound, a clatter of a rock, a creak of a rusted sign, made them freeze. The undead were everywhere, shambling aimlessly, but their hunger never faded. Near the construction yard, they found their first real obstacle: a wide street, open and exposed. On the other side, dozens of undead wandered lazily between wrecked cars and broken storefronts. Too many to fight head-on, Marcus muttered. Dan scanned the area. We need a diversion. A few blocks down, a battered delivery truck leaned against a lamppost. Marcus's face lit up. If we can get that running, even just for a minute, we can draw them away. Emily and Marcus crept toward the truck while the others stayed hidden behind an overturned bus. Jenna held her breath, every muscle taut, watching the slow shuffle of the undead. Marcus popped the hood of the truck and cursed softly under his breath. Battery's dead. But Emily spotted a solution: a solar charger kit half buried under debris. It was a gamble, but they had no choice. Minutes stretched like hours as Marcus jury-rigged a connection. He looked at Emily. On 3. 1, 2, 3. The truck roared to life, a sputtering, coughing sound that cut through the silence like a siren. The undead immediately turned, groaning louder, and began shambling toward the noise. Dan waved frantically. Now! Move! The group sprinted across the street, weaving between wrecks, leaping over shattered pavement. Marcus set the truck in neutral and gave it a shove, sending it rolling down the street, away from them, the engine still sputtering and drawing the horde after it. Breathless but alive, the group slipped through the gates of the construction yard. Inside, it was a gold mine. Stacks of steel pipes. Rolls of heavy chain. Pallets of bricks. Rusty but serviceable vehicles. And best of all, a partially built office with strong walls and heavy doors. Emily looked around, a spark of real hope igniting inside her. We can make this work, she said. Dan clapped Marcus on the shoulder. You did good. Jenna grinned, her face smeared with dirt and sweat. Now, she said, gripping her spear, let's build something they'll never forget. The survivors had found more than just supplies. They had found a chance to strike back. And for the first time, the undead would be the ones walking into a trap. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the construction yard, but the survivors didn't waste a second. Every heartbeat felt precious, every breath a countdown until the undead found them again. Dan Rivers took charge quickly, barking orders with the sharpness of someone who had nothing left to lose. Secure the perimeter first. Block the main gate, then the side entrances. Move fast. Marcus Lee and Jenna ran to the machinery lot, finding chains and steel pipes. They worked together, looping chains through the gates and anchoring them to a cement mixer too heavy to move without power. Meanwhile, Emily Carter organized a second group. Using broken scaffolding and sheets of metal, they created walls within the yard itself, corridors that would funnel any intruders straight into kill zones. The undead didn't think, they just moved toward noise and movement. That mindlessness could be used against them. Make them come where we want them, Emily said. Turn their numbers into a weakness. They fortified the main office as a final fallback point, smashing out glass windows, reinforcing the doors with metal braces, and setting up lookout points on the roof. They didn't have rifles or fancy gear, but they had crowbars, spears, bats, and a burning will to survive. Jenna, smeared with dirt and grease, paused for a second and looked around. We're really doing this, she whispered. Marcus grinned despite himself. Not bad for a bunch of civilians, huh? By late afternoon, the place was a fortress. But defenses were only part of the plan. They needed weapons, traps, that could do what sheer force couldn't. Dan and Emily worked on that next. They rigged cars without batteries to act as barriers and noise traps. If pushed or bumped, the loose metal and broken alarms inside would create loud distractions, drawing zombies toward dead ends where fighters could pick them off safely. They set up tripwires made from electrical cords, tied between steel rods hammered into the ground. Any zombie stumbling into one would trigger a shower of rubble from above, or a rolling barrel to smash through their ranks. Marcus even managed to jury-rig a few crude explosives using leftover propane tanks and wiring from the construction site. They placed them at key choke points, ready to detonate with a simple pull of a wire. As night crept in, the survivors gathered in the center of the yard, exhausted but brimming with a strange kind of energy. They weren't just reacting anymore. They were ready. Dan stood in front of the group, his face illuminated by a flickering lantern. "We've done everything we can. Tomorrow, they'll come." Emily stepped beside him. "And when they do, we'll show them that Crestwood isn't dead yet." A heavy silence settled over the group, not fear, not exactly. It was something deeper, determination. They ate a meager dinner of canned beans and stale crackers, taking turns keeping watch. No one really slept. Every distant groan in the darkness set nerves on edge. Around midnight, Jenna tapped Dan on the shoulder. "You hear that?" He strained his ears. A distant, growing moan, dozens, maybe hundreds, echoing together into one rolling wave of sound. The undead had caught their scent. And they were coming. Marcus tightened the straps on his homemade armor, a wild light in his eyes. Showtime. Dan gripped his bat, feeling the worn leather tape wrapped around the handle. He wasn't just a baseball coach anymore. None of them were who they used to be. They were warriors now. Forged by terror. Hardened by loss. Outside the gates, the moans grew louder. Shapes appeared in the dark, staggering forward, drawn by the scent of the living. The survivors took their positions behind barricades, on rooftops, behind traps and makeshift weapons. Every heart beat the same rhythm now, not of fear, but of defiance. Emily whispered to herself as she lined up her first shot. "Come and get us." The first wave of zombies slammed into the barriers, triggering tripwires and noise traps. Chaos erupted, but this time, it wasn't the survivors who panicked, it was the undead who stumbled into carefully laid destruction. The battle for Crestwood had begun. And for the first time, it was the living who had the upper hand. The first crash of the undead against the barriers shook the ground like a thunderclap. Dan Rivers gritted his teeth as the front gate rattled under the pressure. Chains held, for now, but the horde was massive. Dozens, maybe hundreds, clawing and pressing against each other, desperate for the scent of life. "Hold your ground," Dan shouted. From the rooftops, Emily Carter and Jenna let loose their first barrage. Bricks, cinder blocks, and sharpened poles rained down onto the crowd. Every impact sent a zombie sprawling, but more always took their place. Then, as the first few undead pushed past the broken vehicles at the gate, Marcus Lee yanked a wire. Boom! A propane tank exploded near the choke point, sending a fireball into the night sky. Zombies were thrown backwards like rag dolls, their numbers thinned, but not broken. The survivors had planned for this. The undead stumbled forward, triggering the tripwires. Heavy barrels rolled down constructed ramps, smashing into the staggered zombies and creating deadly pileups that blocked others behind them. Jenna hooped from her position atop the office building. "It's working." Dan swung his bat as the first few slipped through the traps. He crushed a skull, pivoted, struck another. Bloodless but brutal work. The others followed, their homemade armor protecting them from bites and scratches as they fought with all they had. Still, the waves kept coming. Minutes stretched into an hour, then longer. Sweat poured from every fighter as they struggled to hold the lines. Arms grew heavy, legs ached, but adrenaline pushed them on. Emily called down from her perch. Left flank breaking. Dan turned and saw it. The metal fence on the left had begun to buckle under the sheer mass of the undead pressing against it. Marcus! Dan barked. I'm on it. Marcus sprinted across the yard, shoving a wheelbarrow filled with bricks toward the gap. Together with two others, he overturned it and kicked the bricks into place, creating a desperate makeshift wall. It bought them precious minutes. But then came the unexpected. A new group of undead stumbled into view, larger, faster than the others. Runners. They had learned from past attacks. A few infected were quick, relentless, harder to trap. They sprinted through gaps, weaving around barricades, heading straight for the survivors. Jenna gasped. We didn't plan for them. Dan tightened his grip on his weapon. Stay together. Don't get separated. The courtyard erupted into chaos as the runners crashed into their lines. Spears jabbed, bats swung, knives flashed in the dark. Emily dropped down from the rooftop, landing hard but rolling to her feet. She drove a metal rod through one runner's chest, barely dodging another as it lunged. For a moment, it seemed they might be overwhelmed. Then Marcus, thinking fast, activated one of the emergency generators they had salvaged earlier. A floodlight blazed to life, cutting through the night and blinding the charging runners. The sudden brightness stunned the faster undead, giving the survivors a critical opening. Dan seized the chance. Push them back. With a roar, the survivors counterattacked. They moved together, tight and disciplined. Every swing was calculated. Every step reclaimed ground. Slowly, painfully, they drove the runners back into the main mass of slower zombies. Finally, the tide began to turn. The traps, the barriers, the teamwork, it all started to pay off. The numbers of the undead dwindled, their moans turning into confused grunts as they stumbled into one another, leaderless and mindless. An eerie quiet began to settle over the construction yard. Only a handful of zombies remained, the last, weak ripples of a deadly wave. Dan smashed the final undead creature to the ground with a heavy blow. The thud echoed in the silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Jenna, bloodied and battered, let out a shaky laugh. Is it over? Marcus dropped to one knee, gasping for breath. I think we won. Emily staggered to Dan's side. She looked at the ruins around them, shattered barricades, scorched earth, broken tools, and smiled grimly. We held Crestwood, she said. We really did it. Dan nodded slowly. His body ached, his hands trembled, but inside, something fierce burned. They hadn't just survived the night. They had fought back. And they had won. But even as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Dan knew one thing. This victory was only the beginning. The undead were everywhere. And the real war was still ahead. The sun finally broke over the horizon, casting a warm, golden light over the devastation. Crestwood, once a thriving town, now looked like a graveyard, a battlefield where hope had fought against overwhelming odds and, against all expectations, survived. But the survivors weren't celebrating. There was no time for joy. There was only the silence of victory, tempered by the knowledge that their fight was far from over. Dan Rivers stood on top of a nearby rusted vehicle, scanning the landscape. His heart still pounded in his chest, but the fear was gone. It had been replaced by something else, purpose. We've made it through, he said, his voice hoarse. But that doesn't mean the world is safe. Not by a long shot. Emily Carter stood beside him, her clothes stained with dirt and blood, her eyes tired but resolute. We fought off the horde. We have resources. We've got a chance. Her voice cracked as if she, too, was absorbing the gravity of what came next. Jenna, bruised and cut but never broken, clapped her hand on Marcus's shoulder. You guys did good. But now, what's the next step? Marcus, his face still smudged with soot, wiped his brow. We're not out of the woods. The zombies, they're not all gone. And we know there are other survivors out there. Some of them are probably worse than the undead. Dan nodded. That's why we can't just hole up here. The traps and walls we built, that was a temporary solution. The undead will keep coming, and other people might be worse. We need to move forward. They had all heard the rumors, safe zones, fortified cities that were rumored to still stand. But they had no way of knowing for sure. The world had changed, fractured into pieces, and no map could guarantee their safety anymore. Emily folded her arms, deep in thought. So, where do we go? We need a place where we can rebuild, Dan said, scanning the horizon. A place where we can learn, grow stronger, and defend what's ours. But the real question hung in the air like a dark cloud. Where? They had no answers. No real plan. All they had was each other. It was Marcus who spoke up, his voice softer than usual. We could head toward the coast. There's a small community rumored to have been set up there before the outbreak got worse. It's a long shot, but it's better than nothing. Jenna didn't hesitate. I'm in. We can't stay here and wait for another horde to come knocking. Dan's eyes flicked over to the others. He could see the resolve in their faces. The battle had changed them all, not just in the physical sense, but in spirit. They were fighters now. They understood that surviving wasn't just about staying alive. It was about fighting for something, fighting for a future. He turned toward the old truck they had used to create the diversion earlier. We've got supplies. We've got weapons. We've got a plan, for now. We can make it. The survivors packed what little they had, loading up their weapons and ration supplies into the truck. Marcus made sure the engine was running, a risk, but necessary. If they could make it to the coast, they might just find the safety they desperately needed. As they climbed into the truck, the reality of their decision settled in. They were leaving Crestwood. The place they had fought for, bled for, was no longer their home. The world outside was vast, unknown, filled with danger. But there was no turning back now. They drove out of the construction yard, the last remnants of their barricades slowly disappearing in the rearview mirror. They drove in silence for a long while, the weight of the world pressing down on them. The road ahead was uncertain, the challenges unknown. But they had a chance. It was enough. For now. Dan glanced over at Emily, who was staring out the window, lost in thought. We'll make it, he said, his voice firm. Emily gave him a weary smile, her eyes heavy but resolute. We have to. And with that, they pressed on, into the unknown, into the endless waves of the undead world that awaited them. But they weren't just survivors anymore. They were fighters. And they would face whatever came next, together. The end.